Welcome to the Fantasy Footballers DFS podcast with your hosts, Kyle Borgononi and Matthew Betts.
Hello, everyone. It's late August. Things are heating up in the football world, and I'm here with my good friend, Matt Betts, and we're going to be talking some DFS 101 today, so I'm pumped just about football happening. What about you, man?
Let's go, Kyle, man. It's time, dude. Fantasy football is here. We are in the heat of draft season. Football is just a few weeks away, and of course that means DFS is just a few weeks away. So like you, I am super excited to get into tonight's show. I love talking strategy. I know player analysis is fun, and kind of talking about our player takes is always fun. But for me, going back to the start of everything and the basis of your knowledge about DFS and kind of your strategy, really, I think is where you can get a leg up on your opponents and really set yourself up for success. So I'm really excited for tonight's show.
Yeah, it's a DFS 101 podcast might sound for some people like way too elementary. Like, all right, I've done this before. I've played DFS, but honestly, for a lot of us, we have to change the way we think when we play DFS. You know, if you've been doing best ball drafts, you know, we've participated in a couple of industry drafts. Right now, we're in a writers league draft together. With DFS, you have to change your mindset, and we'll talk about this today, but with DFS, you have to shift every single week and kind of restart. You know, with a redraft team, you have your crew, you're working the waiver wire. With DFS, you're having to make sure that you don't just abandon ship because you had a bad week. So this is a great episode. I love talking strategy as well. It's just the way my brain thinks. I'm a teacher, so I love explaining, but hopefully for listeners out there, you guys are looking at our content that we have out on our website at thefantasyfootballers.com. You're listening to the main podcast, but this podcast is a chance to take it a step further, and you take that addiction you have to fantasy football, and every single week you get to step it up a notch with DFS. So we're excited you guys are in. If you want to go to iTunes, subscribe, and review, that would be incredible. My mother-in-law listens to this podcast, I just found out.
That's excellent.
She doesn't know a thing about
I gotta say one
DFS.
thing too. My wife now, for the last week and a half, any show I've been on, including this one, she will listen back to and say, "Did I get a shout out? Did you guys give me a shout out yet?" I'm like, "All right, babe, like we have, but it's over. Like it's time to move on." So yes, she is listening to the show as well. So this is super exciting to have our families listening in too.
Yeah, we need that mother-in-law shout out, the wife shout out. You know, maybe we'll keep a running meter of just who gets the shout outs. You know, maybe we'll throw it out to random people out on Twitter with our mailbag later. But we got an awesome show. And really for the rest of August, we're going to dive into some tools and some research of how we approach DFS each week, talk about the DFS Pass, which right now, if you want to go online and use the DFS pod promo code, then you can get the DFS Pass for a little bit off the $60 price tag, and you get the UDK for free. You're really getting a steal. And we've talked about this the last couple of episodes, but we contribute to that DFS Pass every single week. So when it's week one, you're going to get the content that you need. You're going to get the Vegas totals. You're going to get a first look pricing guide. And then we're going to talk about specific matchups. You're doing a Thursday night preview column. So there's some awesome content in there. And the DFS Pass is something that everyone should check out at thefantasyfootballers.com. Anything you want to add about the DFS Pass?
I mean, just the value is insane. For what you get and the price you have to pay to get the UDK for free is awesome. And then you talk about in season. I mean, I hope our listeners listening to this podcast combined with reading the DFS pass content is just going to pay for itself. You know, $60, you play a couple slates throughout the year, it should pay for itself. So yeah, it's an awesome deal.
Yeah, it's been a busy couple of weeks over with fantasy footballers. We've had our UDK ramp up, our DFS Pass coming out, just added some new writers that I'm really excited about. And then just a selfish kind of plug here, we just came out with a book on Amazon called Fantasy Football Unleashed, and I helped to edit that content, something that Andy, Mike, and Jason have kind of put together over the years. So that was a fun little ad that came out this week. It was free to everyone that's part of the Foot Clan. So it was a pretty exciting week, but turning the page, looking at week one, I want to get us a quick question. And looking at DraftKings and looking at FanDuel, we've talked about how the prices came out. And one of the things we do in the DFS Pass each week is on Tuesday, we have a first look article that I get to write where we look at how the prices kind of affect the way that you construct your roster. So just looking at week one, let's start off with DraftKings. Who are some players that you would consider underpriced for week one?
Yeah, we talked about this player on the last show in best ball values. Terry McLaurin, currently priced on DraftKings at $5,600, is the 25th wide receiver in pricing. And we talked about that being his ADP on the last show and about how ridiculous that value is. On average last year, he was priced on DraftKings at $5,800. So he's less than what he was last year, which for a player entering year two, hoping to take a massive step forward, we would hope to see that pricing, well, maybe not hope to see it go up, but expect it to go up. And now I think we're getting him at a great value here early in the season. And he gets to take on my Philadelphia Eagles. And as I've said before, I'll believe that secondary is good when I see it. So I'll be playing Terry McLaurin in week one, no doubt about it.
Yeah, remember he went off week one last year, right, against your Eagles. And it seems like he's priced at his floor. Right now, he's only going to be more expensive. So yeah, I love that pick. I know it's a homer pick because he's your boy, but yeah, I don't mind putting him on there. Again, he's your my guy. That's coming out this week too for our writers. I'm gonna go with a team that for some reason, although they were the runner-up in the Super Bowl, the 49ers are kind of criminally underpriced. Let's just start with Tevin Coleman. Is he the starting running back? I don't know. It could be Mostert, could be Coleman, but Coleman right now is at 4,200 on DraftKings. That's the RB 47. I mean, that sounds ridiculous that he's buried that low. And if you think he's the guy, I don't mind taking a stab at him as your RB2 or your flex spot in DraftKings. And then also, if you want to stack some 49ers, if you want Kittle in there, maybe you think Brandon Ayuk is somebody week one you want to go after. I love Jimmy G. He's at 5,800. He's the QB 15. And if you look at Jimmy G's schedule for the first couple of weeks,
it's
I really
juicy.
like it.
It's juicy.
He's much more handsome than the other Jimmy G in the NFL, Jimmy Graham. And
By a
so
long shot.
I've been calling Jimmy G as just handsome Jimmy, and then Jimmy Graham is just Jimmy Grandpa. That's what I've been referring to. Or the less handsome Jimmy G. But I love those 49ers. They're just underpriced. QB 15. I'm coming out with another article talking about pricing for each position. And honestly, the way that you save the most in DK is if you find the quarterbacks that are cheap. They're just priced a little different than FanDuel, where they're kind of all bunched together. In DraftKings, you can find these massive values. So on FanDuel, who's somebody you like?
Yeah, for me on FanDuel, I'm looking at Kenyon Drake's price tag of $6,600 as the 14th most expensive at running back, and he's ranked behind Mark Ingram, which I can't fathom in week one DFS with the fact that we know Kenyon Drake is the guy. And of course, there's rumors about J.K. Dobbins, but we do expect Mark Ingram to be the guy most of the season. But at that price tag at RB14, where, you know, he's coming out, he's going to be the guy guaranteed week one. He's going to get a ton of volume, and the price might reflect the matchup a little bit. He's taking on the Niners, and so on the surface, it looks really scary. But that defense over the second half of the year just absolutely, crumbled. Injuries and that sort of thing kind of really affected them. So I'm not really convinced that they can't run the ball. We saw the Cardinals offense be able to be matchup proof last year. And so I'm not worried about the matchup at RB14 pricing. For me, I'll have a lot of Kenyon Drake again in week one.
Yeah, I feel like with the Cardinals, the concept that most people just put in front of them is that they want to go up tempo. They have Cliff Kingsbury. They want to run this kind of air raid offense. But like towards the end of the year, that team was bent on running the ball. And Kenyon Drake was a league winner for a lot of people in redraft. But yeah, that price saves you a ton of money. I'm going to go with a pair of tight ends. I want to point out tight end is rough when it comes to DFS because it's very clear that you have to spend up to get someone like George Kittle. So I said earlier, I love Jimmy G, but if you're going to stack him with someone, Kittle's the obvious choice, but you're paying $8,000. Now, granted, it's against the Cardinals, who were the worst against tight end. And so I feel like that's going to be chalk. I feel like people are going to look at those rankings and see the green number, which we'll talk more about those numbers and how they affect people's psychology and just the way that they get players. But people are going to look at Kittle, and he's $8,000. But there's a pair of tight ends that if you want to punt the position, I feel like they have relatively safe floors. One of them is Hayden Hurst of the Falcons, 5,200. And they play the Seahawks. The Seahawks gave up the third most points against tight ends last year. And I think he's safe. I think he's a safe, 4 or 5 targets, maybe get in the end zone, and you've more than doubled or tripled your price tag. And then another tight end that's super cheap is Ian Thomas of the Panthers, 5,100. We'll be talking a lot about the Panthers this year as a team that we like to stack. And if you like Teddy Bridgewater, who's another cheap quarterback, Ian Thomas is someone that I highly recommend for you guys as well. So let's get into the main portion of what we're talking about today, and that's DFS 101. We're just going to talk about starting a foundation of how do you think about DFS. And that's kind of the key point is we're changing the way that we think about fantasy football. That's the biggest difference, I would say, is just the mindset of a redraft player and a DFS player. So what would you just say before we get into our main points? What's the biggest difference for you when you think about plugging in your lineups for redraft and then selecting based on salary cap for DFS? How do you change the way you think?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest answer is just that it's a 1-week season, and in redraft, you can get away with kind of playing some like low upside guys and kind of get by with 8 points from your tight end and you're happy because your running back did great or quarterback went off or whatever it is. In DFS, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this here in detail, if you're playing in one of those bigger tournaments, I mean, you're shooting for the moon. You're trying to go for it all, and you're also calculating other risks too. So it's really about kind of understanding what your lineup is trying to achieve. Are you trying to beat one person, or are you trying to beat like 1,000, or 5,000 or whatever it is. And so again, we'll talk more about that here in a minute, but that mindset just changes so much about how you go into your lineup building compared to being able to just beat one person in a redraft league.
Yeah. Another thing just to keep in mind is you can't see your opponent, until lock. So you don't really know what's going on. And so with redraft, you're basing your matchup on, this player has a giant ceiling and I need this because the guy that I'm playing this week, he's projected for 30 more points than me. So I need to go for the moon, put in Deshaun Jackson or something like that. With DFS, everyone is setting their lineups and you're blindly just going through the process thinking that, hey, I think this player is chalk this week. And that's the term that gets used a lot, is just this guy is someone that everyone's going to plug in. 25, 30% of the lineups in a tournament are going to have this guy. And you just don't know. Where that shows up the most, honestly, is just when you play head-to-heads. And that's something that I think if you're starting DFS for the first time, you need to start small. And in head-to-head matchups, you're not having to hit the nuts every single time and have all of your players go off. So if DFS is something that you're starting off with, cash games, which is really my first point here, cash games is something that you need to commit to for at least a season. Contest selection is something that I feel like I was so bad at when I first learned DFS. I saw the commercials. I saw the guys getting handed the huge checks, and I said, well, that's clearly going to be me because I am different.
I can do that.
Isn't that what we all think? I mean,
yes.
I feel like whenever, did you ever have those contests for school, like in elementary, maybe you had a bingo night or just something like that where you're like, I'm going to be the one to win the big prize. It's clearly going to be me because I have something special no one else does. And in DFS, it's just who has the information, who's able to adapt. And with cash games, you're actually lowering that barrier of being able to play someone else because you're just playing against one lineup. And your mentality shifts. So one of the things that I could tell people is that when you select your contest, start off by 80% of your contests being cash and 20% of them being GPP. I think that's helpful because you can burn through a lot of money real quick in really big tournaments called GPP, grand prize pools. And you'll find out really quickly that, man, I can't keep up with these other people that day in, day out. This is what they do. I mean, people for a living play DFS. This is their job. So for me, that was a mistake that I made early, is I just thought if I just win big, then I don't have to play these little $1, $2 games because I'm going to win the 200,000. And so why would it matter? Did you have a similar problem when you first started playing?
Oh, 100%. Just like you see the, whatever platform you're using, it tells you, how many entries there are. It tells you how much it costs to enter. It tells you what the prize pool is. And so you see, oh, okay, I can enter $5 and I can win $200,000. Like, that's the contest for me, obviously. Like, why would you play anything else? And I was wildly unsuccessful my first season doing that because just like you, I wanted to go for it all. And then as I played more and more and more, I just understood, that'll happen every once in a while. Maybe once a season you win a huge tournament like that. But really it comes down to being able to play smart fantasy football and knowing how to win consistently, playing in those cash lineups. Like you're saying, you're playing against one opponent or you're playing against a couple of opponents. And just, statistically speaking, it's easier to win. And so really, my account reflected that over the course of several seasons, but not in the first. And I had to learn the hard way for sure.
There's some people out there in DFS Twitter community that I think are really good at explaining this. We had a writer that was with us last year, Mitch Carl, who does Rise or Fall. And he explained to me that first-time players get so giddy because they see the prize pool when they don't realize if you're in a giant tournament that has a max entry of 150, the best players are going to enter 150 times. So they have 150 shots where I was taking 2 or 3 and thinking, man, if my guy goes off, I'm going to win. And so another piece of advice with contest selection is if you are going to be in a tournament, start small. On DraftKings, they have tournaments that are, a nickel, a quarter. And then you look at yourself and say, you know what, if there's 150 lineups there, then I'm putting in about $35. And that's a big difference between saying I'm putting in one entry for $10 or for the Millie Maker, I'm putting in $25 and let's see what happens. I just want to encourage people that you start small. So think about $10. Okay. I think $10 is an easy number to start with. Put 8 of that into cash games. All right. Because it'll be very easy for you. Let's say if you hit half of those, you make that money back. And then with that other $2, spend it on GPP. And obviously $10, you can put that in any increment you want. But that's a really good starting place for kind of how you allocate your funds at the very beginning, because after week 2 or 3, you bombed, you went for all those tournaments, you're going to want to quit and you're going to want to go back to a redraft. But we're going to try to keep people to stay in the conversation, to not quit, to go slow. I know that's not fun in this day and age, but to go slow. And over time, you begin to realize what your strengths and weaknesses are as a player. And I think with cash, you get to be in a pool that allows for someone to grow and learn.
Yeah, for sure. And real quick too, we're not discouraging people from playing in those big tournaments. We're going to have a ton of content about how to succeed in those in the DFS Pass and on our show. But like you're saying, if you're new to DFS, I 100% agree. That's the place to start. And when you go into doing those cash lineups, which essentially is you're playing one against one other random player on DraftKings or on FanDuel, you can actually sometimes select your opponent. When you do that, you can also create your own contest and have other people join it with you. And what I want to talk about here just for a minute to let people know about that is you can actually look at the player's profile before you play against them to understand what type of player they are. There are very smart people who know how to take advantage of first-time players in DFS. They will enter like $200 worth of $1 entries or something like that, and they'll create these contests and have random people that are not knowledgeable about what they're doing just entering the contest. And all of a sudden you have this person who knows so much and this person who knows nothing playing against each other, and you lose all the lineups. So what I'm saying is take a look at who you're playing, take a look at how many contests they've entered, try to find someone else that you are similar at as far as your profile, your history of how many contests you've played, et cetera, et cetera. And on FanDuel specifically, I'm not sure about DraftKings, but I know on FanDuel specifically, you can enter contests that are experienced only or beginners only if you are a beginner or if you're looking for more of a challenge. So the overall take home is kind of look at the opponents, understand that you can have an edge in doing so by making sure you're not going up against something that's tough to beat, or vice versa. If you are looking to take advantage of your opponents, you can do that as well on those sites. So I recommend that quite a bit.
Yeah, and like you said, you can choose your opponent sometimes, if you want to do a head-to-head. So take on a friend. Like, there's nothing wrong with that if you want to wager something. Like, those are some really easy stuff. My home league, for a while, what we did is, we would get maybe 5 or 6 of us from the league, and we would just start a simple little pool and, put in $1 or $2, and whoever won that week. And so there's ways to practice without blowing your budget. So what's number 2 on this?
Yeah, the next one for me is, or did you want to go next?
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm going next.
All right, you go next. I was thrown off there by a minute.
It's knowing your scoring. For those of you that are used to your league and the settings that are in your league, DraftKings and FanDuel are very different. In fact, the scoring and the way that the salaries work are incredibly different in terms of how you're constructing your lineup. For one, DraftKings is full PPR, so you're going to get some monster games from running backs like Christian McCaffrey that catch the ball. You also get some crazy bonuses. So they add 3 points if you get over 300 yards passing, or 3 yards if you get over 100 yards rushing or receiving. There's some crazy kind of scores that you can get. I remember last year, Will Fuller was in the 50s when he went off on the Falcons because he went for 200 yards. There's just some bonuses that you need to think about that and saying, if my guy hits 100, he's also getting an extra 3 points. So you can't just use the standard scoring that you see on certain websites or in your league. And then in FanDuel, it's half-point scoring. And so I noticed that when I play across different sites, I get giddy because I look at certain players and I value them a certain way. But really, you have to think about them completely differently from each other in a way that I need to make sure that my wide receivers are guys that can hit 5 to 6 catches, because I want to boost those kind of points. What do you think, just in terms of where you play? Do you play more DK or FanDuel?
Yeah, I play a lot more on DK on DraftKings. I don't know why. It's kind of just a preference thing. I like the interface a little bit more, but regardless, I do play on both. I also agree that you need to be mindful of the scoring system because, like you said, and I think it really matters too for quarterbacks specifically, the biggest name that comes to mind with this, with the 300-yard bonus in a game, is Matt Ryan. You're an Atlanta Falcons fan. You know how much they throw the football. And he was hitting that bonus consistently last year, and I project them to do that again this year. So a player like that, where in your redraft leagues, we always talk about we want those rushing quarterbacks because they provide so much value in fantasy, and it's still
Russian
true in DFS.
Quarterbacks.
Yes.
Russian quarterbacks.
Russian quarterbacks, exactly. Any of those in the league? I don't think so. Because they provide so much value on the ground, and it just helps in redraft and DFS. But in this specific format with DraftKings, you can get those boom weeks, even with guys that throw the ball a ton, like a Matt Ryan. So I do follow it quite a bit for that reason specifically.
Yeah, with DK, it's you have to be able to stack the quarterback and the wide receiver and expect, if you're in a tournament, you're needing about 70 points from those two players. You're asking for 30 points from your quarterback, and then you're asking for your wide receiver to hit upwards of 35 to maybe even 40 points to win a tournament. So it's really key to notice that. Like, if Drew Brees is going off, then so will Michael Thomas. So stacking with those two players makes sense, but the bonuses would take you even more over the top if you think Brees is going to hit 300 and Thomas is going to hit 100 himself. So I play more on FanDuel. I'm used to that. It's the Ballers' kind of preferred scoring system is half point. I feel like DK, there's sometimes these outlier performances that I'm not able to see, but I do play on both. I think it's hard, and we'll get to maybe a question later. If you're trying to play a ton on both, you need to commit to, I'm just looking at my DraftKings lineups when I'm constructing. All right, finish that process and you can come back later and then just work on your FanDuel ones. But if you're a beginner, pick one, start off, see if you like it, if you like the interface or whatnot. In season, we'll be playing underdog week to week. So there's lots of great formats.
Yeah, I think for me too, there's just something fun about like logging into DraftKings and seeing those little green dots go across the line, which you don't really get on FanDuel unless you open up the specific scoring tab. So I think that's why I prefer DraftKings, but I like both and I play on both. My next kind of strategy piece, and really it's not even a strategy. I just want to put this out there for our listeners. You need to have a long-term mindset in DFS to be profitable long term. And what I mean by that, plain and simple, is you are going to lose. It is going to happen at points throughout the year. And the average DFS player, like you said at the beginning, can get really discouraged early on. And that was me. I was like, man, I know a lot about fantasy. I listen to podcasts. I listen to all these smart people. Why am I losing money? And you have to understand, especially in these tournaments type of settings, weird things happen, and guys that shouldn't perform well do, and guys that are supposed to don't and let you down. And in redraft, it doesn't hurt that bad because it's only 1 week and you can come back and bounce back next week. But in DFS, you're putting all that effort into just like that 1 week. And so on the surface, it's like, oh my gosh, this is crushing. Like, how am I going to come back from this? But that is how you succeed long term, is understanding that's going to happen. But if your process is correct, and it's that old saying, process over results, right? If your process is correct, you did your homework, you listened to the show, you read the articles, you did all these things that you were supposed to, you understood the pricing, etc. You did the right thing, and long term, that's going to pay off. So stick with it, stay with the grind all season. I encourage people to set a certain amount of money that you're going to play with from week 1 all the way through, if you're playing in the playoffs, January, and say, this is my budget for the season. I know that even if I lose a little bit early in the season, I can come back and finish strong end of the year. So it will happen. Losses do happen in fantasy and in redraft leagues, and certainly in DFS. But if you have a good process, and we're going to help you find that process, you'll be profitable long term for sure.
Yeah, you have to prepare yourself to be kicked in the groin over and over
yes.
again.
Oh, yes.
And then, I think it's helpful. You get to learn from some of your mistakes. And so like you're saying, you set that amount. Let's just take $100. You're taking $100 at the beginning of the year and saying, I'm going to start with that budget. I'm talked it over with my spouse and said, I'm not going to keep depositing our rent money into DraftKings because I lost it all first week. And then have a spreadsheet. That's what I did a couple years ago. Was I wanted to stay accountable to see week to week, did I really do that great? You can look back a week before and be like, man, my team went off. And you're like, well, I actually only profited about $5 that week because I spent the rest on too many big tournaments. And so
still
get a spreadsheet. It was profitable. We're going places. But for me, I need to see it in front of me to be able to stay with it. There's weeks that you go down a ton. There's weeks where you go up. And then what's important is to kind of see what your return is on your investment, to also just see how much have you invested? Have you put money back in? It's really easy when you put your card in, especially if you have issues, gambling issues, like to just keep putting money back in. But the strategy part is what moves me, why I want to stay with it. I want to be able to construct a team so that week I saw something that maybe no one else did. And if I'm accountable week 1, week 2, week 3, then when I get to week 4, and let's say I didn't do quite the amount of research, or it was just a crazy week, then I can't just throw it all away. I get to go back to that same process that really matters. So yeah, the long-term mindset really matters. It's a long season, right? I mean, you have to stay with it. Is there a point of the season that you feel like people kind of wane?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much excitement in week 1 for football in general, including you and I. And so people will play a lot of DFS in those weeks. The casual people will come out and play. And then all of a sudden, I feel like in the middle of the season, there's kind of a lull where if you didn't succeed early, you're like, all right, maybe I'm not a good DFS player. Maybe I'm just going to stick to my redraft and not really play DFS. And then we kind of see it come back where people then in redraft leagues, if they're out of the playoffs or if they're not in, the championship, they're like, all right, well, I still want fantasy in my life, which obviously, of course you do. Then you're like, all right, I'm back in on DFS. So I feel like it kind of has this like roller coaster effect where people fall off after about the first month of the season and get back on board in the end.
Yeah, it is a roller coaster. And week to week, I find myself, rooting for players I never thought I would root for because they're in my DFS lineup. So it makes football that much more enjoyable. That's the beauty of fantasy. I care about a Browns-Dolphins game.
Oh, yeah.
Whatever
Everyone
the
matters.
matchup is. Especially the one of the craziest parts of when you get on DK or FanDuel is you look at defenses so differently, because defensive strategy in these kind of matchups, especially in tournaments, is you really have to have the team that scored 1 or 2 touchdowns that week to make a difference. And those are really hard. I mean, the best players in the world know that defense is the hardest position in DFS to figure out. And so you get to root for a team. I remember a couple years ago, I had the Jets and they scored 2 touchdowns, and I thought I was the best. I thought I was the best player that ever lived. I think I barely cashed that week, but I chose the right defense. So let's go with this last one. I feel a lot of energy on this last one, a lot of energy about this topic. As a teacher, so I used to teach high school English, we had to create all of our lesson plans through this idea, this theory called backwards design. And maybe you've thought about the concept before of reverse engineering a product, like where you start kind of with this product and then you deconstruct it and then you figure out what it is and then you kind of see the plans and everything out in front of you. I feel like with fantasy sometimes, especially us that live and breathe this stuff, we write about it, we're on podcasts, we look at what happened last year as kind of what's going to be prescriptive of this year. But with DFS, I feel like you have to start thinking backwards. You have to start with an end in mind. So you have to start with a narrative of what you think is going to happen before you select any players. Even for me, before I look at prices, is I get my notebook out, I look at all the matchups, and I look at the Vegas lines. We look at the Vegas lines because they're good at it. They make money off it. This is what they do. Don't mess with Vegas. That should be a new.
That's the sixth tip here. Don't mess with Vegas.
Don't mess with Vegas because you're going to lose. And so you may win one week, where they project a line and say, hey, the Saints and the Falcons are going to go for 55 points. When a lot of those games have gone under, I know because I've watched them recently. But long term, you're going to lose to Vegas. And so you need to first, when you kind of think about constructing your roster for the week, calculate a narrative. Look at the matchup and say, I think this game's going to go over. For some reason, I think this game is going to go over. And right now, Vegas only has it at about 45. I think it's more like 47 to 50 points. And maybe you have a slight edge there. No one can predict the games that go 60 or 70 points. Or remember that Rams-Chiefs game a couple years ago?
Although I feel like people did predict that. I think everyone was like, this is going to be
130 points.
Insane. Yeah, that was wild, man. What a fun game.
I think that was a Thursday night game. It was the Color Rush jerseys.
Monday night game.
Was it really?
Yeah.
I remember watching it and feeling like this is what fantasy football is all about.
It was just on like a month ago, like still in quarantine. And I put it on the TV. I was like, oh, this game was amazing. My wife was like, this already happened. I was like, yes, but we need to relive this. This was amazing. So I just rewatched it not too long ago.
I feel like that should be like the tape that every fantasy football player looks at and just says, all right, this is what I live for, like 70 points on each side. But you need to calculate a narrative first. And then from there, you need to identify the inefficiencies. And that's what we talked about at the beginning. And our quick question is, look at our pricing. Look, we have a first look article that says, hey, this guy, for some reason, he was in the Monday night game. And so his price didn't really change this week. You can actually take advantage of that. And then also look at how much a player is going to be rostered. We have projections in our DFS pass through FanShare where we see how often a player was tagged and we can project where their roster percentage is going to be. And that's really helpful to figure out, hey, everybody this week is talking about Mark Ingram. I thought he was really good when I looked at the Ravens matchup. I looked at the narrative. I'll have him in my lineups, but it seems like everybody else is on him. And so you get to identify the inefficiencies. And the last thing you do is make your lineups. And notice how I said that's the last thing that you do. You calculate a narrative. So you start with the end in mind. I think the Saints are going to go over on their total. You identify the inefficiencies. You say, here's the pricing. Here's who I think is going to be rostered. And then the last thing you do is you stack and you mix. So every team, I looked at this, every team that won the Millie Maker last year stacked their quarterback with somebody else on the same team. And that makes sense. But every single team, it doesn't mean that everybody was on that exact quarterback. It was somebody saying, I'm going to take this quarterback and I'm going to mix and match their options. Last year, if you had a Jameis Winston, was it a Mike Evans week or was it a Chris Godwin week? And so you have to kind of mix that up. The guy who won the FanDuel Millie Maker last year in week 1, the reason he won was because of Sammy Watkins. Remember, he went off for 3 touchdowns and he kind of got to share a little bit about how he landed on Sammy Watkins. He said, honestly, Sammy Watkins was not like someone he pegged as the breakout guy, but he was in the mix that week. He was in his player pool of guys that he said, I kind of like this guy, but I'm not going to be overweight on someone like Sammy Watkins. And that's what you need to do. You need to, at the very end, say, I could be wrong on some of this. If I'm playing in a big tournament, you know what? I need to have Sammy Watkins, but you probably had more Tyreek Hill in your lineup in week one if you were stacking Chiefs. And so that's just important to leave some room for error. And that's why with backwards design, you're starting with the narrative, you're identifying the inefficiencies, and then you're selecting your players.
Yeah, I think that's a great strategy, specifically for like GPP tournament style, for sure. I mean, it's so tempting to log in on Tuesday morning or, whenever you start looking at like the lineups and be like, you'll notice, I mean, if you go in the lobby, it's insane how many people already have entered lineups. And it's just like, you need more time to kind of understand and think about, you can't just go off what just happened last week. You kind of need to have that narrative in your head. Like you're saying, really look at, okay, the pricing is mismatched for player X versus player Y. And then like you said too, with the Sammy Watkins specific example, no one really wanted to play Sammy Watkins, right? So no one owned him in that tournament. But that is kind of what you have to do as well, is also kind of think outside the box. Like, okay, every single person, every analyst, every article I read says that this player is going to be very, very good this week. And some DFS content is free for a lot of people, including the show. There's going to be a lot of people consuming that content that hear the same thing you do. So being willing to be like, well, they're talking about Tyreek Hill, they're talking about the Chiefs. What happens if Sammy Watkins is the one that goes off for 3 touchdowns and just goes bananas? So yes, that's a fantastic example of how to execute that strategy. I like that quite a bit.
Yeah, and that's how you figure out what are the pivots, and like Demarcus Robinson, he had that 1 week where he went off. Yeah. I don't really know if anyone rostered him after that by any means, but you need to be able to locate, this game's going to go off and everyone's saying it's going to be Tyreek and Mahomes. What if this week it's not? What if it's Kelsey and what if it's DeAndre Washington? But those are for giant tournaments where you have to get really, kind of crazy and it matters how much money you put in. But overall, those are some of the basic things that we think would be helpful to start the conversation. But honestly, we're both available on Twitter. I think those kind of conversations are ones we love to have. I've already had a couple people reach out to me and say, how did you get started in talking about fantasy football in general? And then even DFS. And so I kind of get to share just DMs or through our articles to kind of explain those things. So yeah, we're more than willing to share. We want to be accessible. And that's why on the show, we get to get into the mailbag. Mailbag. So we want to get into, I just have 3 or 4 questions here. And that's for this first one's from Jay Storm on Twitter. He says, I'm brand new to DFS this year. How do I start learning about pricing and how to pick and create lineups for the next year before the start of week 1?
I think based off this question, this person is asking kind of like, how do I look at the lineups for week 1 and understand what the pricing means? Is that how you're taking the question? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we talked about a couple of players that we think are undervalued in their initial pricing for week 1. And that's, of course, based off of the redraft prep we're doing, the season long work that we're doing, and that whole sort of thing. But really, when you look at week 1 and you start to learn about pricing, you'll also notice that as the week goes by, or as the year goes by, I should say, that the trend of a certain player will tell you a lot about how people value that player. For example, last year, Michael Thomas was just insane. He was so good, and he was always north of like 9,000, sometimes upwards of 10,000 on DraftKings specifically. And when players peak, when their production goes up, the price will also start to go up most of the time. But you need to have kind of more of a long-term look at it, not just week 1. Look at long-term and say, okay, over the past 4, 5, 6 weeks, this player is averaging X amount of points or X yards or whatever metric you want to use or stat you want to use, and understand that, okay, maybe that spike week right there that they just had and their price went up wasn't really necessary. So I'm going to, fade them this week, for example. And I think that's kind of how you can use pricing to your advantage. But for week 1 specifically, I really encourage using the UDK and kind of looking at how those players are being valued. And then like we did, just look at the order in which they're their price, like Terry McLaurin at wide receiver 25 or Kenyon Drake at running back 14. No one has those players in their rankings, right? At those spots. So that's how you find value. That's how I think you win in DFS, especially in week 1.
Yeah, you can peruse right now the DraftKings or FanDuel apps, and there's some free contests, and that's what I would tell people to do. If you're like not ready to, commit to a certain, game right now, cash or GPP, there's some free ones out there that you can just look at the pricing, kind of scroll through, make some, lineups that you'll never think about again because they're free just to try it out. On our DFS pass, we do have the pricing available for every single person. We also have the inefficiencies where we compare between FanDuel and DK, who's a better value on which website. And I love that tool because I look every single week and you can click on the values and you can say, wow, this running back for some reason is underpriced relative to where he is on FanDuel. And so on DraftKings, I'm going to get this guy, for about 3% cheaper than I could elsewhere. And he's going to be in my lineup because he catches passes. So Chris Thompson's one that I looked at for DK. He's 4,000. If you think that he's going to get some passing down work against the Colts in week 1, I don't mind him as kind of a flex play. If you're stacking with Gardner Minshew, that could be a really slow game with Phillip Rivers. They might just try to run the ball. But I love looking at our tools, which we're going to get into next week, and how you can use those to your advantage just by simply clicking through. We do all the work for you. It's pretty great. All right. Next one's from Randall H. He said, what week would you start putting rookie wide receivers in consideration in DFS? And I think that's a good question because the narrative is that wide receivers take a while to develop, and usually by midpoint of the year to later on they come through. So you think about Deebo Samuel last year, AJ Brown went bananas, Darius Slayton, second half of the year he was awesome, especially for DFS. So do you think about that in terms of constructing your roster, rookie wide receivers at all?
I think it depends on your selection of what contest type you're playing in. If you want to start throwing rookies in your lineup in week 1 in these huge tournaments, by all means, go for it. I mean, Terry McLaurin, Exhibit A last year went off, and I guarantee you wasn't very owned in tournaments. And he went off. Now, that's not the normal. We're not projecting that. That's not the optimal outcome, so to speak, of what I would do in a cash lineup. But certainly, I think the confidence that you have in these players, kind of these rookies specifically, as the year goes by, is going to grow. And with that, it will as well for other DFS players. So I think this is a really sneaky way to get an advantage in those bigger tournaments. If you're trying to win against thousands of people, people aren't going to want to do that. They're going to want to play who they know, the Julio Joneses, the Michael Thomases, the et cetera, et cetera. Not a lot of people are going to play rookies. And so they're a consideration for me, and I'll have a few of them in week 1 in those bigger tournaments. But for cash, I'm going to wait and play them probably later in the year, just like I would in redraft.
Yeah, it's so hard to trust a rookie week 1 in cash lineups. I'm just looking. Brandon Ayuk is 5,200. If you were thinking that's usable on FanDuel, I mentioned Jimmy Garoppolo earlier. I don't mind that. It's just the volume. When you're thinking about DFS, the volume really is king. And because there's so many unknowns about rookies, I can't just bank on, I know Jerry Jeudy's going to get 7 targets week 1. Could he? Yeah, I mean, he totally could. But I can't bank on that. And so it's really hard for me to put my money behind a player like that. Rookie wide receivers are the people that you usually take a wait and see approach in DFS. In those large tournaments, though, there will be players, maybe it's the Justin Jefferson week 1 instead of Thielen. It's him. It's just hard to predict those right now. And so by all means, if you think that's going to help you win a tournament, go for it. I wouldn't go heavy on it. I would just say that maybe you stack whatever quarterback you're using, stack the rookie wide receiver instead of maybe the other guy that you think is a little bit more well-known. I think I said Wookie there instead of rookie.
You did. Confirmed.
Which I feel like would be a solid strategy for teams to use. It's kind of like Jason's Yao Ming strategy. If you've ever heard him use that, I feel like a Wookie wide receiver wouldn't be that bad for DFS.
We're firing on all cylinders today.
All right. Jake Bevins. I'll call you Bevins. Jake Bevins says, why shouldn't So whenever people say that on Twitter, tell me why I'm wrong about this, or they're setting us up to fail. But why shouldn't I take Jonathan Taylor at 5,400 on FanDuel in week 1?
Again, in a tournament, go ahead, do it. I mean, that's going to be something that's exciting. It's going to be intriguing to watch. And if you're trying to win against thousands of people, it's different. But a lot of the cash game lineups that win are with stud running backs. That's the foundation of where you want to go most often in cash game lineups. And clearly, I'm not saying Jonathan Taylor isn't a stud, but when I say stud, I'm talking about like the elite of the elite, the Zekes, the Christian McCaffreys, the Saquon Barkleys, Alvin Kamara, etc. That's kind of where you want to build your foundation in a cash lineup. So I'm not going to play Jonathan Taylor in cash in week 1, because also the fact we just talked about it last week. There's a realistic scenario where Marlon Mack is actually the player you want in week 1. And until we have more information about what that backfield looks like, to me, Jonathan Taylor in week 1 is just a tournament play. But again, if you want to do it and shoot for the moon in that type of setting, that's fine.
The matchup is intriguing. They play the Jaguars, and I could see them showcase Jonathan Taylor, a player they traded up for. But everything we've heard is Marlon Mack is going to be the guy. And so you can't, in your good conscience, say Jonathan Taylor is going to get 20 carries. He's a workhorse guy, but what do you think in terms of touches for week 1? Where do you set the over-under at?
With the matchup involved, because I do think we can see him in the fourth quarter, I would put it at like 10.5.
Yeah, that's not enough for me to say I can count on it. Could he fall into 2 touchdowns? Yeah, I still think Nyheim Hines is going to get his work. I just put out an article about vacated targets and which running backs to kind of target, and Nyheim Hines is still the guy on third down for me. He's not just going to fall off the field. And if he's not getting, let's say Jonathan Taylor gets, 8 to 10 rushing attempts and 2 targets, is that enough to return value? It's not the volume that I want, but 5,400 on FanDuel is enough to mix in tournaments, but you might have to mix in Mac as well. Mac's 6,100, and that's a huge difference for me. I think that's definitely mispriced.
Yes, I agree 100%. I was just going to say that is a misprice for sure. I think we'll take advantage of that in our lineups in week 1.
All right, let's do one more. And this is from Trent Rye. And he talks about how do you each personally manage your bankroll in relation to cash and 50-50s versus GPP. I kind of mentioned that before, but I was also just thinking about what kind of contests do you play? Is there any specific, maybe not named ones, but just is there a dollar amount that you're like, oh, for cash, I'm thinking about this in terms of what I'm putting in. And for GPPs, is there a certain amount that you stay with?
Yeah, so for me in cash lineups, like I typically will play a lot of the $1 lineups, which sounds like super lame because you win, I think it's like $1.80. So you're winning 80 cents on a dollar. But the idea with that is that you can have way more of a sample size. So let's say that you want to play $100 in cash this week. Well, rather than playing in 250 lineups, like $50 and $50, where you could lose both of those, even if you have an awesome lineup. But if your process is correct, and this is what I was going back to earlier, if your process is correct and you win, let's say like 70 of the $100 ones, you're going to come out on top. That's and nice. It sounds really lame, but it does work long term. And that's a strategy I've employed a lot in DFS. So for me, that's kind of how I manage my bankroll. It's more of those smaller contests, but play a lot of them because I mean, hey, I'm listening to Kyle here on the DFS pod. I'm reading the DFS pass. I think I know my stuff, kind of thing. So I feel like I can win that way. And then in GPPs for me, it's kind of, again, that 80-20 rule. I probably go about 70-30. I've had a little more confidence in recent years with GPPs, but for me, I'm still mostly a cash game player at this stage. And then kind of moving forward, I plan to transition more and more to GPPs as I get more confident in the process.
Yeah, with cash lineups, you can think about it like a staircase. And for the dollar cash lineups, I'm probably going to do, let's say you did 10 to 20 of those. You put down $20 on 20 different lineups. And then I'm going to take the next step up and say, you know what, I'm going to do a couple of $5 cash ones as well. but maybe only do 5 to 10 of those. And then I'm going to take another step up and say, I'm going to do 2 $10 cash lineups. So you're basically setting yourself up like a stair system where you're not overloading yourself, but you're giving a chance to kind of work those different tiers and different lineups cash at different moments. You know, there's going to be some dollar lineups that people play a ton of that cash differently than the $5 ones and the $10 ones. And it's frustrating sometimes when you have a really good lineup in the $1 one and then the $10 one, you don't win. But start to think of it like a staircase. And then for me, I've started to become more of a GPP player. I'm probably like 60-40 right now, where I actually play more GPPs at this point. It's been most of the research that I've done with footballers, just looking at matchups, looking at cornerback, wide receiver matchups. It's another article I do in the DFS pass. I like thinking the strategy about GPP. Sometimes though, you go down a rabbit hole of convincing yourself like this is the week that the third string tight end is the guy that scores the touchdown. And you could talk yourself into some crazy stuff. I'll also just add with GPP, try to stay off Twitter a little bit before you start making all your decisions. Like we usually say take Tuesday and Wednesday to just write on a sheet of paper your thoughts, and then we get to come in on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday with articles. Our podcast comes out on Friday and inform you. But I think it's when you get so crazy into stuff on Tuesday that you convince yourself that this is the week for Cole Beasley, that you lock him in all your lineups. You press that lock button and you get 2 catches for 10 yards from Cole Beasley. I don't think you want that. I will say this about Cole Beasley. When he was a Cowboy, I had him for a 2 or 3 touchdown game one year in a GPP. And I did pretty well in that one. But super lucky, super fortunate that Cole Beasley did some big things. I know he's still Mike's boy.
Oh, yeah. The Beasles.
Got to get the Beasles. So before we head out, I want to mention once again Underdog Fantasy, something that we play every single day. I'm still in a draft right now. I'm waiting. I'm the next person up on the queue. Sign up today at Underdog Fantasy and enter the Best Ball Mania for a chance at $1 million in prizes by going to underdogfantasy.com or searching for Underdog Fantasy in your app store. And I can't recommend it enough. It's something that we play all the time. Footballers have a specific Best Ball segment with Underdog on Fridays. It's just a great way to spend, if you're going to do a 30-second draft or an 8-hour per pick, it's a great way to spend some time to prepare for your regular draft. So before we head out, any last thoughts you have, Bets?
Man, football is here. Hard Knocks is on. It's coming, and I can't wait. I'm so excited for this season. I hope you guys will stick with us. Subscribe on your podcast app so you don't miss a show, because we got so much coming for you guys this year. But man, I'm just happy. I'm excited.
He's a happy man. He's a happy married man. Yeah, tune in next week. We're going to be talking about DFS tools and research, and maybe get to hear more from the mailbag.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Fantasy Footballers DFS podcast. Don't forget to visit us on the web at www.thefantasyfootballers.com.